Some legends are told, some turn to dust or to gold, but you will remember me for centuries.
This is the Cameron Parker Show, brought to you by Spreaker, where we discuss everything from around the local professional sports scene in Colorado, such as the Denver Broncos.
Chris Harris comes out. I don't know if he was on the drive, but he said, I knew 15 seconds into that game that I should have been on T.Y. Hilton. If players are coming out and saying that, it falls again on the coaching staff.
Not to mention insiders from around your local sports scene. Ryan Spilborgs, former outfielder for your Colorado Rockies.
It's not going to be the 25 guys that leave spring training that are going to be the only guys the entire season. I mean, you need depth. You need guys that are going to be in your minor leagues that you may not expect.
Ryan Edwards.
You know, when you're talking about an offensive line, it's about the five best guys, right? And you're talking about the five best guys gelling. There hasn't been a lot of time for that.
It's showtime. Are you ready? Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It is another edition of the Cameron Parker Show and Cameron Parker Show Live. And actually, we have CJ joining us right off the top of the show, and I want to thank you guys for tuning in. We'll be touching base, obviously, as we would do on every Tuesday, but due to Halloween and due to my addiction to Halloween candy, we did not do the show on Tuesday. But because there was no show on Tuesday, CJ was generous enough to come on and talk some fantasy football. And obviously, we're going to be talking about the Denver Broncos as well, but as we do every single time when CJ is on, we talk about fantasy football to kick things off on the show, and then we'll talk about the Denver Broncos a little bit later. But, CJ, thank you very much for tuning in, man.
Hey, thanks, man. I love being on the show. Every week it's the one thing I look forward to.
It is the Release the Cranock, or the fantasy football focus segment of the show that I like to call it. I actually called it the Fantasy Football Focus segment back when I was at the Metropolitan State University of Denver. It definitely brings a lot of insight because it's a change of pace. You know, people really. I'm not sure about people right now. With the Broncos certainly having a down year and a down few games, but they are certainly having a little bit of a rough patch right now, and they want something else to talk about. You know, and so
that's the beauty of fantasy football is you get to cheer for players instead of teams. So everybody can still stay involved. You know, like I'm a Packers fan. Aaron Rodgers is hurt. I don't have a whole lot to cheer for, but I can still cheer for my players on my team. So that's the beauty of fantasy football.
Well, let's kind of get into it. You know, I pulled a little bit of the love-hate from Matthew Berry. And I'm sure you have your love-hates or the start and sits as far as best matchups. Obviously, the waiver period had passed. However, it was just one game, depending on some of the leagues that you are in. So you can still make changes to your lineup. You can make maybe some necessary adds, depending on the type of league that you're in. What could potentially be, let's start with the usual, let's look at maybe some potential ads of this week.
Okay, so I had a couple that I was hoping to get for the Thursday night game. They actually ended up doing really well, so I'll touch on that real quick. Robbie Anderson was one of my ads for this week, and he was 4 for 47 and a touchdown yesterday. He beat a double coverage deep, and he got his touchdown. So that was one of the ones that I was high on. But I think going to Sunday games, the most obvious one that might be still available in your league would be Devin Funchess, who just took over the number one job in Carolina because of Kelvin Benjamin's departure. If he's still available in your league, snatch him up. I think he's a wide receiver too the rest of the way. You know, he's definitely startable every single week now. But then also I want to talk about Marvin Jones Jr., who is still available in a good portion of leagues. He's actually getting a higher target share than Golden Tate the last 4 weeks with Matt Stafford. I think that's something to look at. He's had a good couple weeks, but for some reason people aren't trusting him, and I'm not sure why. Matt Stafford obviously looks his way, and so I'm looking at Marvin Jones Jr. this week as either a trade target or somebody to add in your league. Especially with all these bye weeks coming up. I mean, there's 6 teams on bye this week. It makes it really hard to set your lineup. I'd be looking in that direction.
Now, as far as maybe going into the maybe piggybacking off of what Matthew Berry does, the love-hate relationships of maybe putting some players in, you mentioned Devin Funchess, which kind of led me into the Christian McCaffrey effect. You know, he's leading all rookies in receptions, and actually he's leading all running backs, if I'm not mistaken, in targets and reception yards. So even though he may not be racking up all the rushing yards, which I think at some point it's going to come. You know, you drafted the guy first overall, or in your first round draft pick. It's going to pan out sooner rather than later as far as his rushing yards. However, we all know what he can do in the passing game, and you mentioned Devin Funchess. I think Christian McCaffrey is going to see a little bit of an uptick in production.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, anytime that you lose your number one receiver, you know, those targets have to go somewhere. And I think that they're going to try to use a little bit more of a downfield approach. Devin Funchess is going to replace Kelvin Benjamin in terms of production, and then you're going to be looking at trying to go deep kind of in that Ted Ginn role of last year, I think is what they're going to try to fill on the outside. But Christian McCaffrey, I mean, like I was saying, anytime you lose your number one wideout, those targets have to go somewhere. And the check down is the obvious place for those to go. And I think Christian McCaffrey is the obvious check down artist for Cam, and he's, you know, the safety blanket of Cam Newton. Cam Newton's been having some inaccuracy issues, and, you know, I think we can definitely trace that back to his shoulder surgery and the recovery on that. So I think that, you know, it takes it a little easy sometimes. Check it down to Christian McCaffrey, pick up some easy yards, let him put a few moves on some guys, and, you know, I think that his targets go up now that Benjamin's gone for sure.
Now, keeping the running back train and keeping the running backs that could potentially be a love, potentially Lamar Miller. You know, he's going up against the Indianapolis Colts. You look at the matchup there. Indy, obviously we know about the news of Andrew Luck, but that's not on the defensive side of the ball. But historically, the Indianapolis Colts defense has been pretty porous and pretty bad, you know, the past 3 or 4 years because, well, they feel like they don't want to throw money at their defense or their offensive line. You know, they feel like they want to spend it on people around Andrew Luck versus building it in front of Andrew Luck or on the defensive side of the ball. So is it really a really good matchup for Lamar Miller this week?
Yeah, I think so. And, you know, I wrote about this week for fantasygurus.org under fantasy reaction of the Deshaun Watson injury, and I touched at the end on Lamar Miller. And Lamar Miller is the person that I trust the most out of all the Texans that are left after Deshaun Watson getting hurt. You look at what he did last year with Brock Osweiler as his quarterback, and he still racked up over 1,000 yards on the ground with Brock Osweiler. And I think that the offense, even without Deshaun Watson, is improved over last year for the Texans. Lamar Miller has shown that he can still rack up yards with poor quarterback play. So I don't think Tom Savage and his below average quarterback play is going to affect Lamar that much. Obviously, you're going to see some more stacked boxes against the run, trying to key on Lamar Miller, but I think you're also going to see those extra touches because they're not going to drop back and throw it 40, 50 times a game like they were with Deshaun Watson. This is going to be a pounded attack, and Lamar Miller has 90% of the touches out of the backfield. There's not even any competition. I think they're just going to feed him over and over and over again. So he's definitely a love for me the whole season, but let alone this week against the Colts. Yeah, he's a must start for me.
Now, as far as some quarterbacks, this is going to surprise some people, in my opinion. But the secondary is pretty bad, and that's really the only weakness. And it is his first start of the season. but I would actually say that Brock Osweiler, I realize it's the first game, and you really don't want to throw people into the wings, certainly as far as being his first start. However, matchup-wise, and as far as the secondary, now granted, I don't think it's going to be a whole lot of numbers, and whether it's, and maybe I'm just looking at it from the non-fantasy football perspective, but I certainly feel like if you're looking at it, Brock Osweiler, he has an opportunity. If they feel like they want to be a little bit more comfortable with Brock Osweiler passing the football than certainly what Trevor Siemian was doing, then I think Brock Osweiler might surprise some people this weekend as potentially maybe a name to watch. Maybe if you want to be desperate and start him this weekend, or you a little bit down the road, depending on what he does. But I think Brock Osweiler might surprise some people, especially with the Philadelphia secondary.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have gone on here and shown our love for Carson Wentz over and over again. I'm a little bit down on him this week because of the Broncos secondary, but I do expect them to score. Yeah, I think this is going to be more of a shootout than maybe the Broncos are used to, than we're used to seeing with the Broncos. And Brock Osweiler, he's going to have to throw the ball. He's going to have to. And the only thing I worry about is if he comes in and he plays poorly in the first half, and then switching quarterbacks again, or who knows? They weren't very. I don't know if they really wanted to commit to him. They took a little while to announce that it would be Brock Osweiler this week. I wouldn't be surprised that if he comes out and throws 2 picks that they go back to Siemian. I really don't know. It's kind of a disaster in Denver as far as the quarterback goes. If you're in a 2-quarterback league and you're desperate, I see Brock Osweiler chucking it up a little bit to keep up with the Eagles. And we know that he knows the system, that he's worked in it before. He came and had actually a pretty good success as a Broncos quarterback. And I think that you can see him finishing inside the top 20 of quarterbacks for the rest of the year. But certainly not a must-start every week, and he's a desperation play for me at best.
Well, and I think certainly, and it's understandable why. I mean, and you touched on it, because of the fact that the Denver Broncos quarterback situation is pretty bad. I mean, you're going to Brock Osweiler for crying out loud. I mean, and really, and maybe it's just because of the change and the optimism of a new quarterback that kind of makes me a little bit, I guess, positive heading into this Philadelphia Eagles game, and because it's just something new, and I think it's the comfortability factor. So we were talking about offensively for the Philadelphia Eagles as far as Carson Wentz is concerned. That would also in turn mean that and I'm kind of talking about 2 separate topics, but same position here. But you mentioned Carson Wentz. That would also apply for a guy like Alshon Jeffrey or a Nelson Aguilar. And then, however, you go to the other side of the ball, and we mentioned about the secondary, I do think, however, comfortability with Brock Osweiler, talking about Demaryius Thomas, and talking about Emmanuel Sanders. Demaryius Thomas, I put it out about 45 minutes ago before the show went on. But Demaryius Thomas was targeted on average 10.5 times per game when Brock Osweiler was as a starting quarterback. That's a lot of targets. I mean, anytime you get averaged about 10.5 targets, or when a quarterback is looking at you 10.5 times, that means that you are certainly one of his favorite targets. And I think that whether Demaryius Thomas finally puts his demons to rest as far as putting up a touchdown, I think that can happen as well. But again, maybe that's just the optimism in me as far as this coming weekend. But certainly as far as matchups is concerned, it's a little bit better as far as between Nelson Aguilar and Alshon Jeffrey.
Yeah, for Demaryius Thomas, I have him this week as wide receiver number 16, and I can see him going up from there. I have him down at 16 because it's Brock Osweiler and we haven't seen him this year yet, and I want to see what Demaryius Thomas is going to do with Brock Osweiler as his quarterback. Do I think it's going to be any worse than Simeon? Probably not. I mean, those last couple games were atrocious. But Demaryius Thomas didn't really play well either. You know, he had an uncharacteristic fumble. He's just didn't look like himself. And I know part of that is just being in an offense that's not producing can just wear on you. I have him as wide receiver 16, and this week with 6 teams on bye, you're starting him if you have him. But I think he's definitely a high upside play for me this week. You know, with being at wide receiver 16, looking at the people above him, you know, I have Alshon Jeffrey, the spot above him. Alshon Jeffrey, I could see flopping this week because of going up against the Broncos secondary. You know, I could see that happening. Jordy Nelson has Brett Hundley throwing him the ball, the one who I have wide receiver 14. And, you know, Brett Hundley might not do anything this week. He threw for 94 yards 2 weeks ago. 94. And then Jarvis Landry above him, he has Jay Cutler throwing him the ball. And Larry Fitzgerald, another backup quarterback, throwing him the ball. You know, I think if you look at these wide receivers, and I don't know if there's a position in fantasy football that has been more affected by the injuries this year than that group. And so you're going to be looking at a lot of matchup-dependent wide receivers or people that you have to play because, like Demaryius Thomas, you probably drafted him in the first or second round in your league. You have to start him. So I think you're looking at right now who has the higher upside, who might have a big game for me. And Demaryius Thomas is one of those guys that, you know, I expect him to have an average game, but it wouldn't surprise me if he went for over 100 yards. And I think that's something you have to look at with the amount of injuries that have been going on in football, especially to the wide receiver group and the quarterbacks affecting those wide receivers. And, you know, that's why I'm so high on Marvin Jones, because you have Matt Stafford throwing him the ball and not a Brett Hundley or Brock Osweiler. You know, I like people with a little bit of stability. And Demaryius Thomas scares me in that regard, but not as much as some of these other players like Jordy Nelson, who really scares me with Brett Hundley throwing him the ball. So, I mean, we'll have to wait and see what plays out Sunday and beyond. But I still think Demaryius Thomas, you're starting him in every league that you have him. And out of the crop of wide receivers that you have to pick from, he still has more upside than most of them. And so I keep him and wait and see in that regard.
I have an interesting one as far as I talked about Brock Osweiler, maybe as a potential interesting quarterback. But I got one, and he is a wide receiver for the Los Angeles Rams. And maybe it could also go into the quarterback as far as a good situation for him because, well, let's be honest. You know, he was the first overall pick. He had an incredibly underwhelming season as a rookie. But now you look at it, he is maybe an under-the-radar MVP candidate that not a lot of people are talking about, and that's Jared Goff. And you look at the wide receiver that I think is a really good love matchup this week, and that's Cooper Kupp. Folks, I'm here to tell you that whether it's fantasy football or not, Cooper Kupp is a tremendous football player.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I have Cooper Kupp as wide receiver 25 this week, which is a lot higher than most people have him. And I don't know why people are so down on him. That dude, they're coming off a bye week. I expect them to come out strong. Jared Goff, another week to prepare. Cooper Kupp, we play in the slot. The volume is there for him. And when you're looking at a fantasy football wide receiver, what are you looking at other than opportunity and volume? And I think that he has both of those. And so Cooper Kupp is he was on the list for me for loves along with Robbie Anderson this week. Of just two people that two wide receivers that nobody is really paying attention to. Cooper Kupp is probably available in your league, and I would pick him up before he has a good game this week, because if he has a good game this week, I think you're going to start hearing about him a little bit more. You know, he's a rookie, has flown under the radar. He plays in the slot, which is not a glamorous position that you hear a lot of. You know, you think of like the Danny Amendolas, Wes Welkers that have ever played that position. Are really the only ones you ever see getting attention. And I think Cooper Kupp is that kind of player. And I know that that's a lot to say, but I think Cooper Kupp is very comparable to those guys. And I would pick him up before other people start to figure that out. And you might even start him this week. With the amount of bye weeks, he's a plug-and-play guy for me this week. With Jared Goff throwing him the ball, he's shown tremendous improvement over last year, and he has some new weapons, a new offensive coordinator. I think this offense is legit. I don't think they stop this week. So add Cooper Kupp, and I would play him. I'd put him in your lineup. Just no doubter for me. I'd put him in.
So here's some stats for you. I was able to pull them up, and just how ridiculous Cooper Kupp has been this year, as far as potential players and potential guys that are playing well. You look at his stats. My computer logged off for some reason.
You blocked it?
I don't know.
Here, I'll throw some stats out at you.
All right.
And those are, I want to look at the target volume here. Okay, so last time that the Rams played, which was the 22nd, so they had a bye week this last week. Last time he played, Cooper Kupp had 10 targets. I mean, that was the number you threw out before for Brock Osweiler and Demaryius Thomas as a go-to guy. And he had 10 targets last week. The week before that, he only had 3 against Jacksonville. But then against Seattle, he had 9. I think that these start turning into something. And I don't think I'm crazy for thinking that. We just threw out that 10 target number as, a primary guy for Brock Osweiler. But why aren't we saying that with Cooper Kupp
Right.
and Jared Goff?
Well,
Jared Goff obviously looking his way.
So now that I was able to, get back on track and pull up what was on my computer, Cooper Kupp, you ready for this? CJ, he is now tied for third most red zone targets. And as far as fantasy football, touchdowns itself is one of the biggest point production out there. I mean, it's touchdowns. You're going to get the most touchdowns or most points from that. He is third most as far as red zone targets. And in this season, among wide receivers, and he faces the Giants defense, he also ranks as far as receptions per game, which is 5th most. And then you look at the receiving yards per game, he's 9th most. And then you look at as far as completion percentage, that's 10th most. So so the production is completely underrated as far as Cooper Kupp is concerned. And I really do hope that people start figuring out whether it's fantasy football or not, but just as far as how phenomenal Cooper Kupp really is.
Yeah, I think, I threw out this name earlier, and I was serious about it. I think that he's a Wes Welker type. He reminds me of him in every way. And if I can get Wes Welker into my lineup, I'm doing it every time. And, I think that Cooper Kupp is very comparable to that. So, what are we doing not giving him enough credit? I think that wide receiver 25 for me this week is even too low. I'm higher than 95% of fantasy analysts out there. And, I think that if he goes off this week, you're going to see him on a bunch of love lists next week. You're going to see Cooper Kupp this, Cooper Kupp that. But, you could have listened to this podcast and got him a week earlier. Because we're sitting here telling you this dude's legit. And go grab him. You don't need to start him this week. Even if you stash him on your bench just to wait and see, it's going to be worth having later down the stretch. Whether you were set at wide receiver and you end up trading him later, or whether you need a fill-in if somebody's hurt or you have a bye week, Cooper Kupp is the guy that I'm trying to grab.
Do you have any other fantasy starts or sits this upcoming weekend?
Yeah, so I think that kind of the excitement over O.J. Howard has kind of disappeared after he threw up a dud last week. And he's not somebody that I am starting in any league this week. O.J. Howard is, I'm not touching him. But one tight end that I am really going for, he might not be available. He's available in more leagues than I thought, almost 30-40% of leagues. But he should be a trade target, is Jack Doyle from the Colts.
Jack Doyle rules.
What'd you say?
I said Jack Doyle rules.
Jack Doyle rules, yes. And I think that he rules this week. You look at production and who Jacoby Brissett is looking at, and it's Jack Doyle. I mean, he leads the team in targets, he leads the team in receptions, in receiving yards, in red zone targets, everything. Jacoby Brissett is looking at Jack Doyle. Maybe that's Jacoby Brissett and his talent level, continually looking for check downs and safety blankets. But for fantasy football, we don't really care about that. We just care about the production, and we care about the opportunity. And I think Jack Doyle has that. I don't know why he's available in so many leagues. He's a must-start for me every single week. I've hyped up Austin Seferian-Jenkins a lot, I think, and he's had some good weeks. He played on Thursday night. So, but I think I've got a pretty good grasp on where these tight ends, on these tight end rankings. I don't know why Jack Doyle has been so low. O.J. Howard was more added than him last week, and Jack Doyle had a better week. So let's throw out what everybody else is telling you. Go grab Jack Doyle. I know he plays for a terrible team, but he's not a terrible player. So plug him into your lineup.
All right. Well, any other comments before we let you go?
Deshaun Watson is a curse for me, man. He is, and I mean, you never want to hear the news of somebody tears their ACL, especially in practice, misses the rest of the year. But I came on this show a couple weeks ago, and I said, do not start Deshaun Watson against Seattle. He's not going to have a good game. He's a rookie. Seattle's defense is legit. Leave him alone. And then he was quarterback one that week. And I just mustered up the strength to put my pride aside and rank Deshaun Watson this week as my number one quarterback. And he tears his ACL. I don't know what I have to do. I was trying to finally show respect, and he's out, So I got to say, Deshaun Watson, prayers out to you for a speedy recovery. He's a good guy. He's a good quarterback. And I will eat my words and admit that. He's a great quarterback, and I can't wait to see him again next year.
Absolutely. Well, hey, CJ, it is great having you on, and we'll have you on again on Tuesday as far as the reaction and as far as the reaction for the weekend, and then what's upcoming as far as the waiver wire.
All right. Thanks so much, Cameron.
And thank you very much, man. You have a great rest of your weekend.
You too.
All right. That was CJ Cranock, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much again for listening to the Fantasy Football Focus segment of our show. We're going to take a little bit of a break from that, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Brock Osweiler expectations and the expectations certainly that are certainly afoot for the 6'7" quarterback. And I think they're pretty positive, actually, when you think about it. But we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dive right into it. This is the Cameron Parker Show.
Let the heavens roar and all that's within me. Can't stop singing now. Revival is coming. There's no other name. To you be the glory. Every victory you have delivered me. Don't ever stop. Come on and sing it now. Lift up a shout of praise. With all my heart, I will bless your name. Give it all to you. You're all I need. From the grip of pain, you have rescued me. Sweep me off my feet. I will dance for you. Everlasting love always surrounds me. Vindicating grace, my God, you're amazing. Don't ever stop. Come on and sing it now. Lift up a shout of praise. With all my heart, I will bless your name. Give it all to you. You're all I need. From the grip of pain, you have rescued bless your name. Give it all to you. You're all I need. From the grip of pain, you have rescued me. Sweep me off my feet. I will dance for you. With all my heart, I will bless your name. Give it all to you. You're all I need. From the grip of pain, you have rescued me. Sweep me off my feet. I will dance for you.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Brock Osweiler was named starter during the week, and CJ was talking about it as far as maybe they waited too long. Well, in my opinion, they had to make the change because of the fact that, well, one, they didn't practice on Monday, so Vance Joseph wanted to obviously tell the teammates and tell the team certainly that he was going to make that decision, and so he ended up making that call, and he went with Brock Osweiler, named him gave the reins to Brock Osweiler for the starting quarterback gig. So thanks again for CJ for his discussion about fantasy football. You can go back and listen to previous discussions as far as fantasy lineup over on the iTunes. You guys can search iTunes and search the Cam Parker Show and subscribe to the Cam Parker Show podcast on iTunes. Follow the Cam Parker Show podcast on iHeartRadio. And if you are on Amazon Echo, you can say, well, let's listen to the Cam Parker Show on Amazon Echo because I am on the Amazon Echo. So thank you guys for tuning in. And so a lot is happening right now for the Cam Parker Show. It's continuing to be broadcasted worldwide, I should say countrywide as well. Here's the thing about Brock Osweiler. The change had to happen. The change 100% had to happen. And, based on the play that you saw from Trevor Siemian over the past few weeks, it's been depressing. Really, to put it bluntly, it's been 125% depressing. The amount of practice and the amount of time that guy, and I'm not trying to maybe put, maybe I'm putting some respect for Trevor Siemian, but just to understand potentially just how disappointing this is. He is a playbook rat. He soaks up a playbook. But the fact of the matter is that if he can't soak up a playbook and he can't go out there and perform to the best of his ability after what he's learned from that playbook, then he's 110% not your starter heading into the week. And based on the play that he's had, based on everything that he's had at his disposal the last 7-8 weeks, it's been incredibly underwhelming. And the fact that they've now made a change tells you that, well, Trevor Siemian's probably not going to be the guy for quite some time now. Now, granted, I'm a little surprised that Trevor Siemian was named the backup. Now, granted, that just is more to the likes of, well, Paxton Lynch is getting there, but he is not fully healthy yet. And I think that once you start getting Paxton the more reps, the more ability to practice, and once he's fully healthy, that's when you're going to get to the interesting point of, well, are we going to see 3 quarterbacks active for a game for, let's just say, the New England Patriots or maybe even the Cincinnati Bengals? Are we looking at a situation to where Paxton Lynch might actually get the nod for the New England Patriots game? It's a pretty interesting scenario, to say the least. But overall, the Denver Broncos, they made the smart decision. They had to jump cable their offense. They had to take jumper cables and jump cable the offense, and they went with Brock Osweiler. And here's the reason why. I want to get you guys' take on this as far as the potential expectations for Brock Osweiler. Now, overall, I'm expecting certainly a better quarterback play, to say the least. But here's the thing about this game going forward as far as this coming weekend. This is kind of the rare case and the rare breed where usually, and this is just me talking, there's a lot of different points of view out there, as was stated before the show. There's a lot of different points of views out there. But it's never going to stop this show from running. It's just the Cam Parker Show. It will always be running. But here's the thing, is that typically you see typically you see a new quarterback come in and, well, he's just going to do what's asked of him. He's just going to have them run the football, and he is not going to make very many mistakes. He's not going to at least try and push the ball down the field. However, this is kind of a very interesting scenario for the Denver Broncos, because you have the Philadelphia Eagles, who are struggling mightily in the secondary, but that's really their only weakness as far as the defensive side of the ball. The run defense is pretty stout. It's probably top 5, top 6 in the National Football League. They are very stout against the run, with Fletcher Cox, Vinny Curry, amongst many, many others in that defense. Michael Kendricks is another phenomenal linebacker for the Philadelphia Eagles. So they have plenty of playmakers on the defensive side of the ball in the front 7 to neutralize the running game. And then you look certainly at the side of this passing attack. This is really where you get to see something that's a little bit interesting. And I think that there is a comfortability still between Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas with Brock Osweiler. You have to certainly take advantage of a weakness. Mike McCoy's expertise heading into this season was exposing the weaknesses of a defense. And if you can expose the weakness of a defense by pushing the ball down the field and exposing their secondary, then you're looking at a great scenario for Brock Osweiler and certainly for Demaryius Thomas. And as I said during the Fantasy Football Focus segment, and about an hour before this show got started, and that was that Demaryius Thomas, when Brock Osweiler had his 5-2 record back in 2015, is that Demaryius Thomas averaged about 10.5 targets a game. And that just shows you that Brock Osweiler is incredibly familiar and loves to throw to Demaryius Thomas. So Demaryius Thomas's yards production will stay the same, and maybe even see a little bit of a slight uptick. And I love that word, uptick. It's going to see a little bit of a slight raise in production. And potentially even touchdowns too. You look at the games that Demaryius Thomas had against Chicago and not really against New England, because he only had one catch for 36 yards against the New England Patriots. However, the production was there, and especially against Pittsburgh. He was targeted, I believe, 13 times in Pittsburgh, and I think he had 5 catches for 61 yards, but he had 2 touchdowns against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And you look at Brock Osweiler that half, he played potentially maybe the best the best first half against really the Pittsburgh Steelers than anybody that season. Brock Osweiler played with a lot of confidence. He played with a lot of swagger. And that's certainly been one of the knocks about Brock Osweiler. And there's something different about Brock Osweiler this year, unlike years past, is that it really feels that you look at where the Broncos certainly sit as far as offensively, and especially with the quarterback situation. They need a quarterback that has to have the cojones, the balls, to take advantage of a huddle. They have to have a command of a huddle. And Trevor Siemian could never do that. Look, Trevor Siemian played with a lot of confidence as far as going out and learning a playbook and doing what's asked of him as far as running that playbook, but he never really had emotion. He never played with swagger. He never played with a certain type of emotion that players can feed off of as far as an offensive side of the ball. It's the one area where you look at everybody that's on that offensive side of the ball, that it is the one core unit that has needed an absolute kick in the pants as far as emotion is concerned. Look, Emmanuel Sanders is the most vocal mouthpiece of that entire offense, offensive line, running backs, you name it. Emmanuel Sanders is the mouthpiece of that offense. He is the Aqib Talib, the Chris Harris, maybe the Brandon Marshall as well, but he is the mouthpiece of that offense. If what he says is not happening, then potentially the entire offense could buy in. And I think that we were starting to see maybe a little bit of a behind-the-scenes revolt, certainly, of what was potentially happening with the play of Trevor Siemian. Look, I don't know what Emmanuel Sanders is feeling, but when Trevor Siemian was putting wide receivers in bad spots, in bad positions in the game against the New York Giants, He put Emmanuel Sanders in a horrible situation to get a sprained ankle. He put Isaiah McKenzie in a bad spot to get a sprained ankle. That internally keeps and stays with you as far as a football player. I think on the outside he's going to say all the right things, certainly about Trevor Siemian, but at the end of the day, I wonder what he truly feels about Trevor Siemian. And I think that as far as this offense entirely, there is some comfortability with Emmanuel Sanders. Talking about Brock Osweiler. There's comfortability with Demaryius Thomas. I did say to some of the predominantly orange people that Cody Latimer may see a rise in production. He certainly, it seemed, played better with Brock Osweiler when he was there. He had his best game was five catches for 36 yards, and I think that was against San Diego, but it was. I'm not exactly sure what game that was. It may have been Chicago. However, he played better, and you look at overall. The Broncos will maybe have a better. They're going to have a better emotional game. You know, it's a new quarterback. They want to play for that new quarterback. And everybody's going to rise up and want to play for that new quarterback. And I think that, you know, offensive line certainly has been a little bit of an issue in the past few weeks, in the past, the past few years for that matter. Right tackle's been horrendous. Left guard has been horrendous. Every core unit as far as an offensive line and actually 2-3 positions in general, you know, and I think you know, really I think ultimately you look at it, the Denver Broncos, and appreciate the support flowing in on Twitter, by the way. You guys mean a lot. Thank you. I really do think if you look certainly at the aspect of the Denver Broncos in general, the offensive line, like I said, has been horrendous. However, it's been not that bad, I mean, in the last few weeks, but certainly, and especially with the Kansas City game, the running attack was potentially the best it's ever been since week 3. And were there turnovers? Absolutely. But the running, was the run blocking better? Absolutely. The pass blocking was better. It was just those 3 berserk turnovers by Trevor Siemian that put him in a horrible spot. And this is why this game, not just Brock why this game not only means so much to Brock Osweiler, but it means a lot to the offensive line. And maybe I'm going to say something that's going to be under the radar. I mentioned a little bit about Emmanuel Sanders. But is it possible that the offensive line was not liking the play of Trevor Siemian, and they wanted him to get punished and punished and punished? And I don't know. And, you know, that's kind of a crazy thought, certainly, to be going in my head. But, you know, you look at this play, there's potentially, of the top 5 most punished quarterbacks in the last 2 years, Trevor Siemian is one of the most hittable quarterbacks in the National Football League. There probably was no quarterback that takes amount of punishment and amount of licks like Trevor Siemian. You know, and I really do wonder if the Denver Broncos offensive line, and I hate to use this phraseology, but maybe they had it in for Trevor Siemian. And look, I realize that maybe the teams and the team maybe overall really likes him because he's a likable guy. But at the end of the day, if you're not performing, and you're not performing up to the standards that you're certainly wanting to play up against, it's a very scary situation for a quarterback. I mean, Washington went through it. Certainly with RG3, you know. But there was much more going on behind the scenes of RG3 than potentially there might be with Trevor Siemian. But overall, I think you look at the offensive line play, you're going to see, I think, a better performance, whether they put more of a concerted effort into trying to run the football, then that's up to them. They still will be going up against a very vaunted defensive line, and it's going to be up to them if they want to stick to the run. They're going to have to keep that running. They're going to have to keep that rush defense, that run defense constant, and keep the run defense honest. And if they can do that, they might be able to break a 10, 15, 20-yard run every now and then. And I think that if you're starting to see a more production as far as Devontae Booker is concerned, that is why I think Devontae Booker, there was a reason that Devontae Booker was getting a lot of pull from the coaching staff and the coaches, potentially as a starter this coming year. Folks, it goes back to the draft, and I'm not blowing smoke up your butt when I say this. Devontae Booker was the highest rated player on their board in 2016, ahead of Paxton Lynch. And he was drafted in the 4th or 5th round. They have a lot of promise and a lot of ability for... they have a lot riding on Devontae Booker. They love Devontae Booker, and they love the future of Devontae Booker. And I think that ultimately, if you look at it as far as a prospect for next year, and I know we're midway through the season, but I don't see a situation where C.J. Anderson's on the football team next year. I don't. And I think that as far as he's got one year left on his contract, look, he's been great. He's been a great running back just in general, but for some reason, he just can't get to the second level as constant as he did during a second half of a football season. And the issue with C.J. Anderson overall is he can't get healthy. He struggles in the first initial contact, and it's a very frustrating. It's just been very frustrating seeing C.J. Anderson try and run at full speed and get knocked down or get, it seems, pushed back at the first initial contact that he gets. It's really hard to bring him down, but it's going to take two guys potentially that meet him first to bring him down, and then he's tackled, he's stopped. And that is why ultimately I think as far as a future backfield, and maybe next year, and maybe you decide to re-sign him as far as Jamal Charles, but I could see potentially a much better scenario with Jamal Charles, Devontae Booker, and D'Angelo Henderson next year at running back than C.J. Anderson currently right now. And and as much as I am talking up Brock Osweiler for the Philadelphia Eagles game, he is going to have to play better. And whether Trevor Siemian plays next week or the week after that, but the fact of the matter is the quarterback position is porous. It's horrendous. It's a dumpster fire, as a lot of people have wanted to say on Twitter. It's a dumpster fire. And the fact that the Denver Broncos are scouring the 2018 draft class tells you all you need to know potentially about how they feel about the current state of their quarterbacks, which is a huge slap in the face to John Elway. And I hate to say it, because not a lot of people are gonna put a lot of blame on John Elway. But John Elway, if it's true that the Denver Broncos are scouring and scouting and basically doing a lot of homework on a lot of the 2018 draft class quarterbacks, then he got Paxton Lynch wrong. And that's what that would have meant. It means a lot of things. And it means for certain that he was wrong about Paxton Lynch and the development that Paxton Lynch put forth in the season. Now, obviously, what would be best during the season is to see what Paxton Lynch has in as far as the season is concerned. And if Paxton Lynch cannot play this week, but he's potentially healthy for next week, and in practice, Paxton Lynch is maybe the better option for you, aside from Brock Osweiler, depending on how he plays, then you roll with the first-round draft pick and you see what he has. Now, granted, I realize certainly the article that I wrote a few weeks back about Paxton Lynch, don't write him off just yet. All that is and has nothing to do with the first-round label. It really has nothing to do with the first-round label of him. The point is that he has 2.5 games under his belt. Whether he is a bust or not, and he is on the track to being a bust, but the point is that he has 2.5 games under his belt, and it was against the Atlanta Falcons, and it was against the Jacksonville Jaguars, which, by the way, right now, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I've been saying it for at least 2 to 3 years now, Stephen Priest can back me up on this, my good friend from the Metropolitan State University of Denver, and again a good friend of mine. The Jacksonville Jaguars have a terrific defense, a terrific young defense. They've had it for quite some time. They just cannot establish a young quarterback. But the point is that when you play a defense like that, they're still going to expose the weaknesses of a quarterback. And were the play calls certainly bad, and did they not keep it consistent as far as maybe playing to the strengths of Paxton Lynch? Maybe so. And then you look at the Atlanta Falcons game. The Atlanta Falcons went into the Super Bowl. And it was potentially the best defensive matchup the Denver Broncos had all season. And then you look at the Tampa Bay game, and you look at the half game that Paxton Lynch had against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He let it all out. He let it loose. And he played pretty good against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which gave a lot of fans hope. And you look at and I think that as far as potentially what you might see in Paxton Lynch, that's the game that you could potentially look at that could bring some hope for those Paxton Lynch supporters, and potentially why you do not want to write him off. And that is why, as far as just the game overall, if Brock Osweiler does not respond, and does not respond against the Philadelphia Eagles, and whether Trevor Siemian decides to come back in during that game against the Philadelphia Eagles, it will tell you a lot, certainly, if a lot is at stake for that. Because, it tells you that, for one, starting Brock Osweiler means that they haven't just yet given up on the season. And if they say, let's turn to Paxton Lynch, then that tells you full well they have given up on the season. And it's suck for luck 2.0. And it is suck for Cousins, or suck for Josh Rosen, suck for Sam Darnold, suck for Baker Mayfield, suck for Josh Allen, suck for Lamar Jackson. Suck for a lot of different quarterbacks that are in the QB draft class this upcoming season. So there is certainly a lot at stake of just putting Paxton Lynch out there, despite not wanting to write him off. But the one thing it does tell you is that the Denver Broncos are not a huge fan of the 2017 season, and they've given up on it. That's exactly what that tells you. And it's just a bad place right now for the Denver Broncos. It's a bad place as far as the coaching staff, because, they are a very talented football team. And this is why the Denver Broncos, certainly as a whole, have to play better this upcoming Sunday. There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of optimism to play better. But overall, you got to be happy that the Denver Broncos made the right decision. Yes, the right decision to start Brock Osweiler as the quarterback of the Denver Broncos heading into this Philadelphia Eagles game. It is an early game, which does not bode well for the Denver Broncos anyway. They haven't played well against the opponents early in games. And in essence, I think if you were to look at it as far as a potential game and maybe pinpoint as far as some similarities, this has a lot of similarities to maybe the Chicago Bears game that was actually Brock Osweiler's first start. Brock Osweiler, you look at it, he played against the Chicago Bears. I believe it was an 11 o'clock start, if I'm not mistaken. And the Denver Broncos came away victorious, 17-15, on a failed 2-point conversion by the Chicago Bears. A handoff, I believe, was to Jordan Howard, and the Broncos stuffed him on the 2-point conversion. So I think that there is some potential similarities between the Chicago Bears game and what we are going to potentially see against the Philadelphia Eagles, whether it's a W or not. But I think there's potentially some similarities there between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Denver Broncos for that 11 o'clock game. Well, folks, it is the Cameron Parker Show with less breaks and frequent sports coverage. This has been the Cameron Parker Show. I want to thank you all for tuning in to this edition of the Cameron Parker Show. I will be back on Tuesday. CJ will be back on Tuesday, and hopefully we will recap and talk about a Denver Broncos victory. Have a blessed weekend. Be safe. And, of course, go Broncos.